1944, Florence prisoner of war camp, Arizona. The desert did not look like an enemy, but it behaved like one. Heat pressed down from above and rose from the ground in shimmering waves, flattening sound and swallowing distance. The Florence prisoner of war camp sat pinned into that emptiness, a deliberate scar carved into sand and stone, far from cities, far from coastlines, far from anything that felt familiar to the men behind the wire. Every morning began the same way. The sun arrived early and without mercy. Dust clung to boots and uniforms as prisoners assembled for roll call, names answered in tired voices that had learned obedience through repetition. The Americans ran the camp quietly. Orders were given without shouting. Punishments were rare and precise. The guards did not need fear to maintain control. That unsettled the prisoners more than cruelty ever could. Among them was a man who listened more than he spoke. He was not an officer, not a leader, not someone who stood out in a line of worn uniforms and hollow faces. Yet his mind stayed alert, cataloging details others dismissed. He noticed how the guards rotated shifts with mechanical regularity. He noticed which names were called often and which were never called at all. At night, when the camp settled into restless silence, he listened for the sound of trains passing far beyond the fence. Steel wheels against rail. A brief, mournful song. Then silence again. The trains never stopped. Until one morning they did. The break in rhythm came without warning. The sun rose as it always did. The roll call began as it always had. Names were read. Men answered. The ritual moved forward smoothly, predictably. Then one name was spoken twice. The man stepped forward, expecting a correction. Clerical errors happened. Numbers were misheard. Names were repeated. But this time, a guard raised his hand and motioned for him to stay where he was. Another guard approached, carrying restraints. They were light shackles. The iron cuffs slid loosely around his wrists, loose enough to move when he shifted his hands. The detail lodged in his mind instantly. He had seen restraints before. These were not meant to restrain a man who planned to resist. The prisoners noticed it too. No explanation followed. No accusation. No destination was announced. He was told only to gather his belongings. Around him, faces tightened. Curiosity sharpened into something darker. In a place where nothing happened without becoming rumor, this sudden attention felt dangerous. The gate opened. Beyond it waited a truck, engine idling patiently, as if it had nowhere else to be. The sound carried strangely in the open air. The man climbed into the back. A guard followed. The gate closed behind them without ceremony. The camp receded quickly, swallowed by dust and distance. If stories like this matter to you, stories that reveal the unseen moments of the war, this is where WW2 Frontline Legends lives. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from around the world. The road stretched forward in a straight, unforgiving line. Scrubland and rocks slid past in silence. Hours passed without conversation. No towns appeared. No signs. No landmarks he recognized from the crude maps prisoners sometimes sketched from memory. The farther they traveled, the emptier the land became. The man began to suspect this was not a transfer. In the barracks at night, stories had circulated in whispers. Men reassigned for special labor. Men taken for questioning. Men who returned quieter than before. Men who never returned at all. He searched his past for reasons. He had not commanded troops. He had not interrogated prisoners. He had not been important. Yet the truck kept going. When it finally stopped, there was no building waiting for them. No checkpoint. No guard tower. Just open land and a rough wooden railing set into the ground ahead. The guard motioned for him to climb down. Go, the guard said. The word carried no threat. That was what made it unsettling. The man walked forward. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. The air felt different here, thinner somehow, charged. He reached the railing and stopped. At first, he laughed. The sound escaped him sharp and involuntary. What lay before him could not be real. His mind rejected it instantly. offering explanations as fast as it could form them. A painted backdrop, a clever construction, a trick designed to disorient and humiliate him. The ground simply ended. Not sloped, not eroded gently. It vanished, falling away into a vast chasm carved with layers of stone that stretched farther than his eyes could follow. Bands of red and gold caught the sunlight. Shadows pooled deep below, shifting slowly as clouds drifted overhead. He stepped closer. His laughter died. Europe had cliffs. Europe had valleys. Europe had ruins shaped by centuries of war. But this was something else entirely. This was not destruction. This was exposure. The earth split open, revealing its own history in silence. Wind rose from below, cool and steady, touching his face like proof. His heart began to race, not with fear, but with disorientation. The sense that the world had quietly grown larger without asking his permission. A voice spoke beside him. "What do you think?" The man turned sharply. The guard's German was flawless. Not accented, not practiced. Native. The question felt measured, rehearsed, as if it had been asked before, and the answer mattered. The man said nothing. The guard followed his gaze back to the canyon and smiled faintly. "This isn't even the biggest one," he said. In that moment, the man understood the trip had not been accidental. This was no diversion. It was deliberate. He had not been brought here to be impressed. He had been brought here to be measured. If moments like this make you question what you thought you knew about World War II, stay with WW2 Frontline Legends and subscribe. History still has things it hasn't finished saying. A memory surfaced without warning. A briefing room before the war. Maps spread across a table. An officer laughing at exaggerated American claims. "They invent myths," the officer had said. "They exaggerate their land the way they exaggerate their power." Standing at the edge of the canyon, the man realized the laughter had been fear, and fear had been wrong. The guard spoke again quietly. He explained why the man had been chosen. It was not random. Before the war, the man had studied the earth. Layers, stone, time. His academic record had crossed the Atlantic long before he had. They wanted him to see something that could not be bombed, something that could not be captured, something that would remain when cities burned and borders shifted. They wanted him to understand scale. If you're still here, you already understand why stories like this endure. Subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from as this story unfolds. When they turned back toward the truck, the man did not look behind him. He did not need to. The canyon had already carved itself into his mind. That night, back in the camp, he opened his journal and stared at the blank page for a long time. He wrote nothing. The camp did not change after the canyon, but the man did. The fences were the same. The watchtowers cast the same long shadows in the late afternoon. The guards walked the same measured routes. Yet everything felt closer now, tighter, as if the desert itself had leaned inward. Conversations sounded flatter. Arguments felt rehearsed. Even laughter seemed misplaced, like noise in a place that had quietly outgrown it. The man moved through the compound as if he were borrowing someone else's body. He answered when spoken to. He performed his assigned tasks. He ate without tasting. At night, he lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden slats above him, replaying the canyon in fragments rather than images. Depth, silence, scale. The feeling that the war, which had once consumed his entire understanding of the world, was suddenly no longer the largest thing he knew. If this story is pulling you deeper into the hidden psychology of World War II, this is exactly why WW2 Frontline Legends exists. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from around the world. The journal remained untouched. He opened it once, pencil poised, then closed it again. Any honest description felt dangerous. Words could travel. Words could be repeated. Words could be twisted into something he did not intend. Silence, at least, belonged to him. Others noticed. Whispers followed him through the camp like insects drawn to light. Some men thought he had been interrogated. Others believed he had been offered special treatment. A few suggested something worse. that he had been turned, that he had seen something he was not supposed to see, and come back changed. They were right about one thing. He had come back changed. The first direct question came near the water barrels, asked casually, as if the answer did not matter. Where did they take you? What did they want? What did you see? He shrugged and said nothing of value. The man asking smiled thinly, unconvinced. In the camp, unanswered questions fermented. They became stories. Stories became accusations. Silence began to cost him. Days later, an American officer appeared near the barracks, accompanied by the same guard who spoke perfect German. The sight of that guard tightened something in the man's chest. This was not coincidence. Coincidence had no place in a war run by paperwork and intent. The officer asked about his education. The word landed heavily. The man had never spoken of it in camp. He had learned early that education, like rank, could isolate as easily as it elevated. He answered carefully. Geology. University studies. Research interrupted by war. The officer listened without expression, then asked about maps. Not tactical maps. Not front lines. Geological maps. In that instant, the man understood the canyon had not been a message meant only for him. It was part of a process, a calculation. He was not being punished. He was being evaluated. If you've ever wondered how wars are fought without bullets, moments like this are the answer. Stay with WW2 Frontline Legends and subscribe if these unseen battles matter to you. The officer did not explain why the questions mattered. He did not mention Germany. He did not mention morale or propaganda. He simply observed, noted, and left. The German-speaking guard lingered long enough to offer one quiet sentence. Do not speak about it. It was not an order. It was advice. That made it worse. Advice meant consequences already understood. Advice meant someone had thought through what would happen if the story escaped containment. Advice meant the canyon was not meant to inspire awe in the camp. It was meant to stay isolated inside specific minds. The man began to understand his position. He was not important. He was useful. Before the war, he had believed the earth was honest. Layers did not lie. Stone did not exaggerate. Time reduced all things to scale. He had loved that certainty. It had felt separate from politics, separate from ambition. Now he saw how even that truth could be weaponized. The Americans had not threatened him. They had not interrogated him. They had shown him something so vast, so indifferent to human conflict, that the war itself shrank in comparison. They had not told him what to think. They had let the land do it for them. If this realization hit you the way it hit him, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and stay with the story. What comes next changes everything. Weeks passed. News of the war arrived in fragments. Victories. Defeats. Rumors layered on rumors. Men argued fiercely about battles they had never seen, about strategies they could not verify. The man listened without joining. Every argument sounded small now, compressed by something he could not unsee. One evening, while sweeping dust that would return by morning, the German-speaking guard appeared again along the fence line. This time he was alone. No officer. No audience. He spoke softly, almost conversationally. You are not the first. The words struck deeper than any accusation. The guard explained, carefully, that other prisoners had been taken. Not many. Chosen men. Different reactions. Some shouted. Some laughed. Some tried to explain it with numbers, as if mathematics could domesticate the impossible. And some went back and pretended it never happened. The guard studied him closely. It does not matter what you call it, he said. It matters what you do with it. Then he walked away. That night, the man finally wrote in his journal. One line. No description. No confession. Only a question. If the earth can swallow time, what else can it swallow? If this question is forming in your mind too, you're exactly where this story wants you. Subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from as this unfolds. He hid the journal deep among his belongings and lay awake long after the camp went quiet. Somewhere beyond the wire, a train horn sounded again. But this time, it did not feel distant. It felt like a warning. The war did not end with a single moment inside the Florence prisoner of war camp. It faded instead, like a pressure slowly released. The guards stood a little less rigid. Orders came without urgency. The routines that once felt immovable began to loosen at their edges. News traveled in fragments, passed quietly between men who had learned not to trust sudden certainty. Germany had fallen. Berlin was gone. The Reich that had promised permanence collapsed into paperwork and rubble. The man listened as others reacted. Some shouted. Some wept. Some argued violently over who had betrayed whom. He did none of it. He sat still, feeling the strange absence left behind when a belief dies quietly rather than exploding. He had already lost something larger than a nation. Repatriation came slowly. Lists were posted and revised. Names were added, crossed out, added again. Trains that once carried men into captivity now waited to carry them away. The man packed his belongings without ceremony. His journal lay hidden beneath folded fabric, thin and nearly empty, heavier than everything else combined. On the morning he left Florence for the final time, the desert looked unchanged. The sun rose without acknowledgement. The land offered no farewell. As prisoners lined up beside the transport trucks, he noticed the German-speaking guard standing apart from the others, closer to the fence than the road. There was no uniform this time, no insignia, no visible rank. Their eyes met. The guard nodded once. He did not speak. The man understood immediately. There would be no closure, no explanation, no final instruction. Silence was the last order, and it was the most binding of all. The journey home unfolded in fragments, compressed by distance and time. The ocean crossing past in a haze of gray water and quiet decks. Borders dissolved into stamps and signatures. Cities appeared wounded, familiar streets reshaped by absence. Germany greeted him without ceremony, stripped of confidence, heavy with unasked questions. People wanted stories. They asked about the camps, about the Americans, about whether the rumors were true. He answered carefully, offering facts that carried no weight. Enough detail to satisfy curiosity, enough restraint to avoid notice. When conversations turned toward comparisons, toward arguments about whose nation had been stronger, whose cause had been justified, he withdrew. One question followed him more persistently than the rest. What did America have that Germany did not? He never answered it. He returned to civilian life quietly, found work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, avoided crowds, avoided certainty. The war became something people either relived obsessively or tried desperately to forget. He did neither. He treated it as something finished but unresolved, like a sentence that ended without punctuation. The canyon followed him anyway. It surfaced when he stood among ruins and watched men clear debris by hand, brick by brick, as if time itself had collapsed into labor. It surfaced when politicians spoke of rebuilding greatness, of restoring pride, of reclaiming destiny. He heard echoes of old voices in those speeches and felt only fatigue. Maps bothered him most. He could no longer look at them without remembering the depth that had no scale. Lines drawn confidently across paper now felt fragile, temporary. He knew how easily the earth ignored them. He knew how long it took for stone to forget empires. Years passed. The man married, worked, aged. The canyon remained untouched inside him, unchanged by time or distance. He did not dream of it. It appeared instead during waking moments, uninvited and precise. A reminder rather than a memory. When Allied interrogators eventually reviewed his file, it was routine. Another name among thousands. Dates checked. Movements verified. Education noted. One section drew repeated attention. Arizona. The interrogators asked politely at first. What had he been shown? Why had he been selected? What impression had it made? He offered nothing. Pressed further, he spoke carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing measurable. He said the experience was not about intimidation, not about power, not about humiliation. He said it was about permanence. When asked to explain, he fell silent. The final report contained a brief note, written with professional detachment. Subject refuses to describe Arizona. Claims language is insufficient. Claims disbelief remains. The file closed without resolution. He lived the remainder of his life without revisiting the story publicly. No lectures. No memoirs. No confessions. Friends noticed his reluctance to make grand statements. He spoke often of limits, of patience, of how small human certainty appeared when measured against time. When he died, his belongings were sorted quietly. Among them was the journal. Most pages were blank. The paper yellowed with age. Only one line appeared, written years earlier in steady script. If the earth can swallow time, what else can it swallow? There was no explanation, only silence. And perhaps that silence was the true legacy of the canyon. Not awe, not fear, but restraint. The understanding that some truths lose their power the moment they are reduced to words. That some experiences were meant to unsettle rather than instruct. The canyon had never been a spectacle. It had been a message without language. A reminder that some forces did not belong to any nation. That some scales could not be conquered. That wars, no matter how vast they felt, were still brief visitors in a world far older than ambition. If stories like this remind you that history runs deeper than battles and wider than borders, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from around the world.